and you're listening to The New Way. We just opened the show with two patriotic picks from our own co-host, audience member, Gary, who is a veteran. I have to say that I'm Karen, the stand-in host for Dr. Lenny Thyme, your regular host, and I think the most powerful part as I listened to that was the quote that I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And I think that is the definition of patriotism, that no matter what flag you're under, no matter what day of the year it is, holiday or not, the will of man to continue to fight for freedom, and even at the expense of death, sacrifice, leaving behind loved ones, as opposed to the alternative of living on their knees. Powerful. There is a person in our Discord chat room right now who is mic'd in and is also Mike. And in a land of confusion, what do? We search for answers. We look for clues. Is there anybody at any point in time in history that existed and did it better? We look for clues. And so Mike actually has an interest in research focus in mud fossils. And Mike, I don't mean to put you on the spot, and you can decline to talk about it if you wish. But for our listeners that don't know what a mud fossil is, could you briefly tell us, like, what is a mud fossil?
Sure. Mainstream geology tells us that fossilization happens over millions of years of time, and that, sea creatures die on the sea floor, and then that's compressed, and layers lay down over time, and then that eventually hardens and turns to different layers of strata that are then pushed upward through tectonic activity, and that's where we see our fossils, and the layers of strata showing the different eras of fossilization. And I came across videos explaining the concept of what are known as mud fossils, which is the idea that flesh or a creature can be fossilized in a far, far shorter period of time, a blink of an eye in geological time, where if the tissues are surrounded by mud, then the gas and the liquid will work its way out of the tissues, and then the minerals in the surrounding mud will work their way in, and then that can lead to fossilization in very short periods of time. And then I was also exposed to the concept of mud floods, which there's a lot of research being done on now, that there have been worldwide cataclysms, that are essentially unreported in the history books, whereas the traces of those events are all around. We have many cities that have multiple floors of buildings that have been buried under the earth, and then they just put the roads, where the top of that earth is, yet the buildings extend much lower, and so I started getting curious about this fossilization process and these different cataclysms that have gone unreported, and started looking for fossils of different kinds. And initially I started to do research on a mountain that's nearby, because another topic that I got exposed to was the idea of titans. We have these myths of titans, like Clash of the Titans, creatures that were a mile tall, and you think it's the stuff of fairy tales. Yet the different civilizations around the world, many of them have these myths. So the question is there any truth to the myths? We also have flood myths all over the world. Every society has its different flood myths. So there's a mountain here in Spain that's in the town that I live in that's known affectionately as the Elephant, and it looks very, very much like an elephant lying on its stomach. And so as I got exposed to this idea of mud fossils and these global or worldwide cataclysms, I started to get curious about the mountain and wonder, like, is it possible that it doesn't just look like an elephant, but it might actually be an elephant?
Oh, wow. Okay,
So
let me ask you.
I started doing research on it.
Yeah, and
yeah.
I saw some of your video. I saw a video so far. That's extremely interesting. I have two questions. The first one is for the listeners, well, and for me because I don't know either. Is what kind of information can you glean from a mud fossil versus AKA regular fossil?
Right.
What?
Well, if you see, every one of us has seen fossils. You see these spiral creatures that existed, we're told, hundreds of millions of years ago, that no longer exist, and so that's one thing. But then there's the idea that a body can fossilize, and each of the organs in the body are wrapped in their own sacs, so to speak. They're layers of fascia, which are like fatty tissue that surrounds the organ. So our organs are floating around inside of our body in fluid, but they're also attached to the inside of a bigger sac, which is, the abdomen and where the heart and the lungs are. And each of those have these sacs around them. Well, in the fossilization process, those organs fossilize individually. So the more I learned about the mud fossil theory, the more I started to consider that there should be a lot of fossils out there that are looking like organs. And so I went out looking for an example of a mud fossil that was just undeniable, because a lot of the videos that I'd seen, people were pointing out different features of different rocks, but if you approach those videos with a skeptic's eye, you could say, well, yeah, it kind of looks like a rock. They weren't really showing any proof of anything. Mm-hmm. And unless you had some kind of chemical analysis or went in and looked for DNA or something, you were essentially just looking at a rock. So I went out and was looking for, a specimen that I just could not deny. And I found a rock. I'm a chiropractor by trade, so I've studied a lot of anatomy. And I found a rock that it's a heart. Yeah. It's undeniably a heart. It's easily 4 times the size of a human heart. Could be a cow or, some larger animal or something.
You just answered my second question.
I found 16 different, very, very specific correlations between this rock and actual anatomy, and that's one of my videos I've gone through, and I break that down, and I got an endoscopic camera so I could go in and examine the chambers of the heart, and it was just completely undeniable that it didn't just look like a heart, but it actually was a fossilized heart. Well, that rock in and of itself flies in the face of mainstream geology's paradigm and what we're told about, how things fossilize and how long it takes and what to expect. So that was kind of how it began. And then I went out looking for more, because I figured if there was one, I should be able to find several. And that's what my next video, which I'm hoping to be finished with in the next week or so, is going to be on, because I've found literally an avalanche of evidence supporting this theory. So the river bottoms are filled with these kind of curved rocks that we're told are smoothed out because of the movement of the waters and the erosion that occurs as they all bump against each other, and that's why they have these different shapes they have. Well, that might be true of, oval-shaped rocks and other kinds of rocks that just have very, non-specific forms to them. But when it comes to hearts, they're very, very identifiable because they have a very specific shape and they have very specific anatomical features. And it's undeniable, and it's overwhelming evidence that this is actually what's happening. And it may not be true all over the world, but I think in many of the river bottoms of the world, what you're finding are the remains of all kinds of different creatures and humanoids of varying sizes that have died in different cataclysms and have fossilized, and those fossilized remains are still there in the form of organs.
So is that the implications of finding these mud fossils, is identifying proof of cataclysms?
Yeah, well, proof of cataclysm is undeniable. I mean, even mainstream geology talks about, there have been 5 major extinctions.
What other things can we learn from mud fossil organs?
Well,
I find it amazing too, but what are the potential implications of studying these?
Why is it important?
Yeah, what?
I think it's important because it says that much of what we're taught about mainstream geology,
Ah,
how rocks actually form and come about is based on erroneous thinking, and
gotcha.
we have it changes everything as far as timelines. There's a lot of things that have been hotly contested and disputed throughout the history of geology. I mean, things like carbon dating, which we're told, oh yeah, you can just do these tests and determine exactly how old something is. Well, carbon dating was hotly disputed, and it's there are a lot of people who say they've thoroughly refuted it as a technique for dating, and that's just one of many of the different cornerstones of geology that people have broken down and dismantled. Yeah.
You know what's interesting? In mainstream, I mean, I don't know if it really is like this because science, I got scared of science my sophomore year of high school. That is a traumatic event I'm still trying to recover from. But regardless, I have found that working in the medical profession as a social worker, I've gotten very interested in science and would sit down with many med students, nurses, residents, doctors that would spend the time to explain things to me. And so I've become fascinated. But what is interesting is that it seems like in the science world there's a pecking order. Why? And this may be true or not, but it seems as though geology is at the bottom of the pecking order. Like somehow it's typecasted as not a real science. Is that been your experience, or do you think that there is um, anything at play here with regards to delegitimizing the field of geology for that purpose? I mean,
Well, I have a number of thoughts about that. One, I mean, geology is very concrete in the sense that
no pun intended.
If you take something like psychotherapy, that's not exactly a science because there's so much subjectivity. It has to do with the psyche and all these things that are unmeasurable.
Right.
But when it comes to geology, it's a natural science, and there's loads of different divisions and branches within it's an absolutely huge discipline, geology, and it's also very compartmentalized. But I think what's significant about the work that I've done is it shows that a lot of the foundational ideas that the whole ology is based upon could very well be wrong and need to be revisited, and it has profound implications because it suggests that a lot of what we think of as rock that's just come about through different geological processes are actually rocks that have been formed biologically, and that these were once beings that were alive or parts of beings that were alive.
Wow.
So it changes how you see the world. It's almost, I've had people tell me that it's like, watching your videos has been like taking a psychedelic trip, but it's worse because it's permanent,
Yeah.
It's like, because it really does, it changes your relationship to nature around you, but not for everybody. Some people are like, well, what does it matter? It doesn't change my life. I still have to go to work in the morning and pay my bills, and so for some people it doesn't seem to have much importance at all, and other people it's like the most profound idea they've come across. So it's been fascinating to see how people respond and react to it.
Well, I think discovering the beings and studying them, I mean, wouldn't eventually, let's say you're in one dig, wouldn't you begin to, from metadata that you're collecting, to get ideas of how maybe life was organized, those kinds of things that could, I don't want to go out on a limb here or whatever, but as you stated, social sciences are, they don't have exact fact. There's a lot of variables, and it's based on observations over time and comparing and contrasting before this and that and blah blah blah.
Yeah, it's not so empirical. You can't create like a scientific experiment that would confirm or reject a hypothesis.
Yeah, everything comes down to the probability, and the big goal is the probability plus or minus one differential. And even then, I could argue, just again, after getting out of graduate school, being in practice, it is really easy to kind of shape things to get that plus or minus one differential factor.
Are you talking about like confirmation bias, where a person has
like the
reliability? They're invested in the outcome, so they alter the experiment with maybe without even realizing it, just because they make certain assumptions.
Well, yeah, but even Dr. Lenny has had that pressures with chemistry experiments to ignore certain things or factors that would potentially alter, but because the corporate agenda is to push this view or this outcome, and we need an academic paper that says this is the outcome. But either way, don't you think that if you, let's say you go to this mountain and you start collecting all these rocks and you start examining them using all your awesome tools, and I mean, wouldn't you begin to, from the metadata, wouldn't you begin to be able to put together some logical sequence or story or timeline or something that tells us more information?
Absolutely, and that's what needs to happen more and more. People need to start revisiting the natural sciences with new eyes, because a lot of what we've been told and taught about, the world, the physical world, is based on things that are not true. And when it comes to academia and ologies in general, what is an academic discipline? If you take geology as one, and the study of world, well, you're going to have academic institutions in the universities. They're going to have professors. They're going to have professors with tenure. These are people who've published many, many papers. They have graduate students that are working for them. And all of that is based on a paradigm that is based on a certain sets of principles. So if you come up, it's like if you want to challenge Einstein's theory of relativity because you are more in alignment with, the kinds of things that Tesla taught, you're going to have real challenges because that's the prevailing paradigm. So the problem when it comes to publishing papers, first of all, is, they say the textbooks are 10 to 15 years behind what's really happening in research. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that you've got people who have a vested interest in really, really radical ideas not getting through. And it's all based on peer review when it comes to publishing.
Right.
So what is peer review? Peer review in and of itself is a logical fallacy. It's an appeal to authority. Mm-hmm. So it's a group of people saying, okay, we think this has merit, so we're going to allow it to be published. That doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the truth of it or not. It's what they think and what they've determined.
Right.
And maybe there's no better way. Maybe that's ultimately the best way to do it. But the problem is that it breeds nepotism and it breeds, backstabbing and, patting each other on the back. And then the money comes into it. And, wherever there's money, that leads to corruption.
Well, exactly. Money. And then also the other thing people get great, motivation from is status. I'm published, or this is my work, or this is that thing. And so because society applauds people, and I, quite frankly, for my waking up process, I found that my education has been a disservice because I have to unlearn and relearn the right way, almost. That's what it feels like for me. That's not saying that I'm negating and wiping away everything that I've ever learned, but I have had to balance, and because my thoughts from so many years of applying the same principles with exactly how they were taught, and I have to resist the natural urge, and I'm still catching myself. But, this thing with peer-reviewed papers, I actually have met some academic professionals that, to get around the whole peer review thing, they've actually chosen to publish their findings in something like the New York Times. Mainstream.
It causes problems.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Lenny! Are you safely in New Mexico?
Oh yes, I was safely in New Mexico when I talked to you last, and I was at a restaurant that I ended up having to walk out of because it was just, the menu was all carbohydrates. As long as you eat schlock, you could get anything you wanted, but if you were looking for like a salad, it wasn't on the menu. But you're talking about something about education, and it requires discernment, and the stuff that you're educated in that you really studied and internalized and got to know, your judgment is good enough to make the call on whether it was right or not, and technically it was right. The problem is, right and wrong are not the way of looking at things. What we want to do is be technically correct so that the methods we use are the best methods, and the results will improve as we go through more iterations of what we're doing.
Right. And we have to be vigilant to try and avoid things like cognitive bias. And I talk a lot about pareidolia in my videos, this, where you are recognizing a pattern that doesn't actually exist. And with what I've done, that's really important because, for example, with the videos that I've done on the existence of titans, there are loads of videos out there and channels that are showing all kinds of pictures of mountains, that the shadows have hit the mountain just right and it looks like a big face, and they're presenting that as factual evidence that titans actually existed. And, it may just be a pretty hefty case
factual
of
evidence.
pareidolia.
Yeah, factual evidence, when facts are arbitrarily set, make for a real strange reality, don't it?
Yes, absolutely.
I think
the thing is, I'm also artistic. I can lay on my back and look up at clouds and see things that aren't there and enjoy that as an exercise. And, I've painted and photography. So pattern recognition can be a wonderful thing when it comes to creativity, but it doesn't mean the pattern you're recognizing actually exists.
I have to agree with you 100%. The other thing is that sometimes you get to a place where you would have gotten to anyway, and somehow we feel connected to the route that we took to get to that place, and we convince ourselves that that's the route to get there, and then that it's the only route to get there. And then if you didn't get there by that particular route, you might not have been there, and then anybody who's there who didn't use that route now is not like thinking. And not like thinking, I think, is something good, not bad, because if three people all take completely different routes and get to the same place, you can be sure that that was the right place to be, because each correct route got to the same place, no matter how different they were. And so a lot of the individual problems we're having are trying to conform to groups that have absolutely no interest in the individual whatsoever, but run the world supposedly for the benefit of individuals, but really the individuals they're running for the benefit for are the ones who are controlling the system. So system thinks, don't use that system. Well, one-size-fits-all system needs us to create a new system to work with, but we've got this selection bias in that we've already learned the system, internalized it, and can't look at it arbitrarily to weigh whether new information added on top is still good information from the foundation at the bottom. And what we're really finding is that the foundation of the bottom was wrong in the first place, so that anything going on the top is an imbalance because there's something fundamentally wrong with the undergirth. And I think I've got a way of attacking that problem, but it is way too deep for the last 20 minutes of the radio show. It's a whole 2-hour show in itself.
Yeah, it's not a small overhaul that's needed.
And it's not something that we can do on any scale other than human scale. And the first human that you have to convince is yourself. And then once you've gotten through the one of convincing yourself that you've got to do something different, you got to project yourself into the world and see what difference it makes. And then go back to that self and tweak it so that when you hit the world, it's the self you want the world to see. And it might not be your whole self because you got to keep guarded. This is a mean world. But once you've got yourself and your worldview picture going, that's when you can hook up with other people and get to two and start discussing how things go. and then you add a third person, and that's where really you're starting to get into the power structure, is three people on equivalent level having conversations coming from different perspectives because the viewpoint can triangulate. But what we really need are some outside eyes that haven't grown up through the system that can put together a logic base that can look at the system and say, oh, here's where you made the mistakes. This doesn't follow, that doesn't follow. And certainly water has consciousness, so that if you're thinking that the consciousness is in the organic structure of people's brains, hearts, or guts, you're deceiving yourself. We have to go back to water. Water is in everything, and most of biology is done. The mechanisms for figuring out structure are all done by dewatering everything.
And so the electrical and chemical impulses that are propagated through water.
Right. So automatically by eliminating the water, you've changed the structure. So the function of the structure you get from crystallography is a dewatered functional structure. But the water is what makes it function. When you dewater it, that's not functional.
Right.
See, there's another portion of chemistry that interests me, and that has to do with food. People eat healthy, but they don't realize what healthy is, and so the things they eat are what they are taught is healthy, but the healthy things to eat are the things that you need to balance your diet nutritionally. What's the status of nutrition in this world? Confusing.
Pathetic. Yeah. Well, when I went to high school in California, the different brochures and books that we got on the subject of health were being produced by the Meat and Dairy Council. I'm sure they didn't have any self-serving interests, but
none at all.
That's sarcasm. But they did a complete inversion of the food pyramid that we're still living with, essentially, because if you go into the stores, you find that 80% of everything that's in there is based on wheat and high fructose corn syrup and whatnot. So
carbohydrates. Pump us through carbohydrates, reduce the protein, cut the lipids away entirely, and make it so that the fruits and vegetables that you serve have lost most of their potency because the enzymes have broken down in getting them from farm to market.
Yeah, plus the mono farming culture, where you just grow one crop over and over again until the topsoil is destroyed, which is widespread.
Really destroyed.
Right, depleted. Yeah.
I'm sorry, for those of us that are not scientists, what is mono farming?
Well, it's like when you see corn as far as the eye can see. Instead of having a biodiversity of a lot of different crops where as one plant is flowering and giving fruit and then dying away, and then those different minerals go back into the soil, and there's a richness and a biodiversity, and you get the bugs, and you get the worms.
Bridgitte talked about that yesterday. I think T, you were there yesterday. She talked about that, and that she mentioned that there was just basically like everything fits together like a puzzle piece, and she's looking to create biodiversity in large lands. That's one of her many projects, but I digress. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that listeners knew what mono farming was. Okay.
If you want to know more about it, I think a good catchphrase is permaculture. That's one of the words that a lot of the people who are into this use. Creating a permanent culture. In other words, that there's a lot of life happening instead of just one kind. I wanted to just return a bit to one thing you were saying, Lenny, which, to me, one of the things that really needs to happen as far as academia goes is cross-disciplinarianism, which is a word that I don't even know if it's a real word, but it's one that needs to exist if it doesn't. And, what's happened with academia is it's been increasingly compartmentalized, so people know more and more about less and less. So then they become specialized, they're locked in their own little worlds, they don't have a broader perspective because they spend so much time, becoming masters at their little niche, and maybe their little niche doesn't really even have a solid foundation because it's not based on a more holistic, picture. And the discoveries that I made with regards to the rocks are the reason those happen is, one, because of my educational background, but I know nothing about geology. I've never even studied it from an amateur basis. I got introduced to some ideas. I had my chiropractic training, in which I studied, the first 3 years of chiropractic school are similar to medicine. A lot of the same subjects are covered. So I knew a lot of anatomy and physiology, and so then when I got into this idea and I started looking at the rocks, it's like, boom, I started making connections and like, whoa, wait a minute. And so here I am, coming up with things that are, they're fairly groundbreaking. A lot of people consider that. And I don't even have a background in these disciplines. So that's when there's a synergy, when people come together across different disciplines and are sharing ideas. I think that needs to happen a lot more.
I completely agree, and I think the sampling we have here in the Discord chat room, where we gather together to put this live show on Monday through Friday. We have just such a great, diverse group in terms of backgrounds and those kinds of things. So I know that Dr. Lenny, he must have lost a connection, but I know that he concurs with exactly what you're saying. And I really like the word cross-disciplinary, because what they use in the healthcare system, which is literally, I also study organizational ethics, is literally the most complex industry in the United States of America, even above the airline industry. And what contributes to a complex industry is compartmentalization, specializations, just as you mentioned, with high coupling, which means, quick action between transactions. And the more complex an industry is, the less it's going to be able to, in my mind anyway, it's going to be able to meet human scale need. And that's the one word that we talk about over and over again, is doing things according to human scale. But before I forget, Mike, because we are slowly approaching the last 10 minutes of today's show, can you share with the listeners where they can find your videos, watch them for themselves and I watched them yesterday, and I mean, I was glued to the video.
The channel name is Stellium7. It's spelled STELLIUM as in Mike, and then the number 7. And currently there are 5 videos. One is called Mud Fossils, the Heart of the Matter, and that's where I go through in great detail this rock that I found, and explain, all the evidence that shows that this rock was actually once a heart. I'm currently working on the follow-up to that, where I just drive the point home, with oodles of proofs. And then the other 4 videos are a series that I did called Unveiling a Titan, and I talked about it a little bit earlier about going and studying a mountain that's very close to where I live, that looks a lot like an elephant, and it doesn't just look like an elephant. It was actually once a titan, and it sounds like the most absurd idea. And I never would have believed, a year and a half, 2 years ago, if someone had told me that I'd be studying such a thing, that I would be. But the more I looked into it, and the more I started to really examine it from a scientific perspective, and analyze the different rocks, and look at the structure, and actually go into the different caverns that exist within the creature, the more coincidences, or I prefer the word coincidences, because they're coinciding. It's not just a chance happening. There's actually a correlation between the anatomy of an elephant and the physical structure of this mountain. So those 4 videos, the first one is just an overview, and then the second one I go specifically into the eye, and the third one into the ear, and then the fourth one I treat it like a forensic analysis, like somebody's at a crime scene, and I'm looking at the actual tissues of the mountain and showing how that would correspond to the tissues of a smaller being. And the advantage of being tiny when you're looking at a 5 kilometer long mountain is you don't need a microscope because you are the microscope. So that's what I did. It sounds kind of crazy, but the people who have actually gotten through the videos are pretty much all very convinced that what I'm claiming to have found is actually what there.
Yes, I noticed that in the comments, many people were just in awe. They hadn't come across or encountered that type of analysis and investigation before. So I think you've really hit on something. I do want to say that when I saw that heart in the video, I was like, that's not a human heart, is it? I mean, like, that's just too big. I mean, it was bigger than your hand in the video. But, you know, there is talk about that giants walked amongst us at one point. I mean, do you think there would be a way to tell at some point whether this heart is that of, like you said, a cow or something like that, as opposed to an actual human?
Well, here's the thing. That particular heart could very well be a cow, for example, something, you know, a lot bigger than a human. But the thing is, I've gone back to the river bottoms and I've found I have a heart that I use as a footstool now that's 2 foot long. And so that's, you know, the biggest land creature is what, a giraffe or an elephant, and I think this is well bigger than their heart would have been. So I believe giants existed. I think the evidence for that is overwhelming. I think there's more, in many ways, there's more evidence for giants than there are for dinosaurs.
But wouldn't there be differences?
That's a controversial topic.
Yeah, but wouldn't there be differences between a cow's heart and a human heart? Aren't there differences? Like, I get that.
Yeah.
I went through your video. I saw, you know, the anatomy of the heart, blah 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 blah. But is that is the anatomy the exact same of a heart in a cow with the chambers, the aorta, like all of that stuff that you talked about?
I think just like with skeletons, there are far more similarities than differences. I mean, there's some creatures that have 3-chamber hearts, and who knows what kind of weird hearts are out there as far as, you know, different odd creatures. I don't have access to, you know, 3D renderings of hearts of different kinds of creatures. So in my video, I compare it to human anatomy because it's very very close to the human anatomy. And there's so many different tools available online to actually look at the anatomy in great detail, inside and out, 3-dimensionally. And that's what I cover in the mud fossil video. So I think there are definitely variations, but it seems that across creation, both sea creatures and land creatures, that there are great similarities in anatomy and skeletal structure, even though the overall morphology and shape of the creatures varies a great deal. Cranial structure and organ structure and that sort of thing, you know, it's very similar.
That is amazing. Wow. Like, you know what I think's going to happen, to be honest with you? I think as you continue to put out these videos and talk about it, there's going to be people that are going to emerge and they're going to say, actually, I saw this, and they're gonna start lending like their, just what you said, cross-discipline. I studied such and such, but by putting yourself out there in your research, and I felt like it was a great length for a video. I think it was well organized. It was in a logical sequence format, and for somebody that has post-traumatic stress from like science and chemistry in my sophomore year of high school, the fact that I could keep glued for 20 minutes or 18 minutes or whatever it was, that says a lot.
I'm really happy that you say that, because that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be, you know, for the layman, the person who doesn't have a background in these things. I didn't want it to make it inaccessible, and I was hoping that people would take to it like that, and I've gotten several of those kinds of comments.
Yeah, you don't want to be one of those
the way I've done it.
academia snobs. That was actually one of the I actually taught at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. I loved being an adjunct faculty, and was approached many times about, why don't you go for your PhD, be a full-time professor? And I'm like, yeah, I would rather shit glass than be a full-time professor. Like, there's just no way. The pressure, this many researches, this many publications, you end up, I would be living on my knees, as Sir Francis Scott said earlier when we opened up the show today. I would be living on my knees, and that's not how I roll. I roll kind of independently. Which, speaking of, how are you, like, are you just now, like, totally immersed in this mountain that's close to your home? Or has this changed your
every once
structure
in a while,
of the
I
day?
hike a lot, so it's my favorite exercise and pastime. I love being in nature. So every once in a while, I run across a new discovery. So at some point, I'll do a 5th video on the Titan. But for the most part, my research there is done. And what I'm hoping will happen is that more people will start to because there are a lot of mountains around the world that have very, very specific features. And it may just be pareidolia. It's just chance that they look that way, but they might also be actual titanic creatures. And if that's the case, and somebody else or multiple people start to approach the study of those mountains with the same thoroughness and scientific eye that I've done, where they're actually looking at empirical evidence, they're comparing it, they're not just taking photographs of things going, oh, this looks like a face, so it is a face. That's not necessarily the case. And that's mostly what you're finding out there in the mud fossil community. You find people that are trying to study the chemistry of how things would fossilize, and if you start with this, it'll end up like that. And that's all very important, but they're often doing it while looking at rocks that, it's like, oh, it's hard to tell what that was. Maybe it's what the guy thinks it is, and maybe it's not.
Right.
And that's, I think, what's so significant about what I've done. And since I put that video out, it's only been seen by, I think it's had 1,000 views. I've had several different people contact me with photographs of images that were very, very clearly hearts. So it's so repeatable. It's so, it's so easy to do. I went down to... can I share a picture?
Well, our listeners and the radio won't. In ornery.
Yeah.
And,
anyway, I was at the beach the other night for about half an hour or 40 minutes, just sitting there, with the waves coming in, and I gathered 50 at least different little miniature hearts, because whether they're bird or fish or what they are, who knows, but they're tiny. But it's the same form repeating itself over and over again. And that's what I teach people how to see in the first video. And then in the second video, they're going to see how they can apply that knowledge that they've acquired from the first video to go out and spot these things very, very easily. And, if a ton of people start to do that, you're going to get some people that don't necessarily have the eye, and they're just coming back with rocks that, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you're going to get a bunch of people that are going to be finding rocks that just have far, far too many correlations to actual anatomy for it to be chance.
And we are near the end of the show. Thank you so much for sharing. I think what you're doing is great. It's inspiring people to open their eyes. And that, if anything, in and of itself is profound. You're listening to The New Way. We're on Monday through Friday. Enjoy your Alex Jones if you're staying on for the next show. And we will be back again tomorrow on Friday. Happy 4th of July to those American patriots. Bye.
Bye-bye.